If you tell them
They're
what
coming.
you saw,
We
they
have to go
won't ask
now.
questions.
But the
They'll
water.
just pick a
No
rope.
time. Mount
The
up.
old stable hand had once said.
Hold on
and
tight.
Ethan Cole never forgot it. Not in a town where silence weighed
I have
heavier
it.
than truth.
It's
Before
heavier
we
than it
go
looks.
on, tell
Careful.
me where you're
Could be a
watching
trap.
from.
Let me see.
And if you believe justice doesn't
it's mine.
always
I
come
found
with
it.
a badge,
All right.
stay with me.
But we moved
Because
together.
what happened at that creek wasn't something a man could explain twice. The water ran cold even in late summer, cutting through the stones north of town, like it had somewhere better to be, and most folks stayed clear of it after sundown, not because of danger, but because of stories that never quite settled right. Ethan rode there by accident, or at least that's what he told himself later, tracking a loose steer that had wandered off in the night, its hoofprints faint in the dry dust before disappearing near the bank. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, quiet except for the steady rush of water and the soft creak of leather as he dismounted, boots pressing into mud that hadn't seen many visitors. That's when he saw her. Clara Whitlock stood knee-deep in the creek, skirts darkened by the current, sleeves rolled past her elbows, her hands moving slow and deliberate beneath the surface, as if she was searching for something she couldn't afford to lose. Ethan didn't speak, didn't move, just watched from about 30 feet away, close enough to see the tension in her shoulders. The way her breath came measured, controlled, like someone holding back more than words. Then the current shifted, and for a second, something darker than water slipped between her fingers, carried downstream before vanishing against the rocks. Ethan's jaw tightened, not from fear, but from recognition, because out here, you learn to read signs without asking questions, and some signs didn't need explaining. A branch snapped under his boot, just a small sound, but enough. Clara turned fast, eyes locking onto his, sharp, unflinching, not startled the way most would be, but calculating, like she had already measured the distance between them and decided what it meant. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low, steady, carrying over the water without effort. Ethan didn't reach for his gun, didn't step back, just stood there, the weight of the moment settling in his chest like something familiar. He'd seen that look before, in men cornered by fate, in women who had already lost more than they could name. "Neither should you," he answered, just as quiet. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of river and something else he couldn't quite place, and for a long second, neither of them moved. He could turn around, ride back, pretend he never saw a thing, let the town sort out whatever story came drifting in with the morning, or he could stay, step into something that didn't belong to him. Clara's hands slipped from the water, droplets falling back into the creek, her gaze never leaving his. "You didn't see anything," she said, not as a plea, but as a statement. Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, past the water, past the silence, and something in his expression shifted, slow and quiet, like a door opening without a sound. "No," he said after a moment. "I saw enough." Clara held his gaze a second longer, then slowly stepped back toward the bank, water slipping from her clothes in thin streams that darkened the dirt at her feet, and Ethan noticed how careful she moved, not weak, not frightened, but measured, like every step had already been considered before it happened. The creek kept running between them, steady and indifferent, carrying away whatever had just passed through it, and for a moment, it felt like the only honest thing in sight. "You should go," she said, her voice quieter now, not sharp, but firm in a way that did not invite argument. Ethan did not move, his eyes drifting past her shoulder to the far ridge where the land opened into dry grass and scattered pines, the kind of place where sound traveled farther than it should. He listened, not with his ears alone, but with the instinct that had kept him alive through too many seasons. And there it was, faint, almost swallowed by distance, the rhythm of horses moving fast over hard ground. He exhaled slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. "They are already looking," he said. Clara's jaw tightened just enough to show she understood. She followed his glance toward the ridge, then back to him, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken settled between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. "If they find you here," she said, "they will not listen to anything you say." And there was no fear in her tone, only certainty. Ethan gave a slight nod, as if that was the least surprising truth he had heard all day. "They do not listen much anyway," he replied. The wind shifted again, carrying dust from the south, and the Distant hoofbeats grew clearer, no longer something imagined but something closing in, deliberate, inevitable. Clara looked down at her hands for a moment, water still dripping from her fingers, then wiped them against her skirt as if finishing something that could not be undone. She stepped closer to the bank, closer to him, but still kept a distance of about 10 feet, enough to leave a choice between them. "You can still walk away," she said, her eyes steady, searching his face not for permission, but for a decision. Ethan studied her, not the surface, not the moment, but the weight she carried behind it, the kind that did not come from one mistake or one bad turn, but from something deeper, something that did not fit neatly into the stories towns like to tell. He had seen men lie to save themselves, had seen others tell the truth and lose everything anyway, and somewhere between those two, he found himself standing now. He reached up slowly, unbuttoning the top of his shirt, not out of comfort, but because the air felt tighter than it should, then let his hand fall back to his side. "You asked me to forget what I saw," he said, his voice low. Even. Clara did not respond, but her eyes did not leave his. "I cannot do that," he continued, and for a brief second, something flickered across her expression, not surprise, not disappointment, something closer to acceptance. Ethan took one step forward, closing half the distance between them, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. "But I can choose what it means," he added. The words hung there, quiet but heavy, and the sound of approaching riders filled the space behind them, no longer distant, no longer avoidable. Clara's shoulders straightened, not in defiance, but in readiness, like someone who had already faced this moment in her mind more times than she could count. Ethan glanced once more toward the ridge, then back at her, and without another word, he reached for the reins of his horse, the leather warm from the sun, and held them out in her direction, not forcing them into her hands, just offering, steady, certain. The choice was no longer about what he had seen at the creek, but about what he was willing to carry after it was gone. Clara did not take the reins right away, her eyes dropping to the leather in Ethan's hand as if it carried more weight than a horse ever should, and for a second, the world narrowed to that space between them. 10 feet of dirt and silence stretched thin by the sound of riders closing in. The creek kept whispering behind her, steady, uncaring, while the wind tugged at the edges of her sleeves, drying what little water remained. "You do not even know who I am," she said quietly, not as a warning, but as a final measure of what he was about to choose. Ethan's grip on the reins did not tighten, did not loosen. It stayed exactly as it was, calm, offered, like a man who had already stepped past doubt. "I know enough," he answered, his voice even, his eyes steady on hers. The hoofbeats were closer now, no longer a distant rhythm but a presence that pressed against the air, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a voice carried faintly, calling out to others, sharp and certain. Clara lifted her gaze toward the sound, then back to Ethan, and something shifted in her expression, not relief, not trust, but something quieter, something that came when there were no better options left. She stepped forward at last, closing the distance, her hand brushing the reins before wrapping around them, her fingers cold from the creek but steady. Ethan released them without hesitation. For a brief moment, their hands shared the same space, not touching, but close enough to feel the choice that had just been made. "They will ask questions," she said, her voice low, almost lost beneath the rising wind. "They always do," Ethan replied, a faint breath of something that might have been a smile passing across his face before it disappeared. Clara turned toward the horse, placing her foot in the stirrup, moving with a quiet efficiency that spoke of someone used to leaving places without looking back. She paused just once, her hand resting on the saddle, her head tilting slightly, as if she might say something more, something that would make sense of all of this. But whatever it was, she let it go. Instead, she pulled herself up, settling into the saddle with a steady motion. The horse shifted beneath her, sensing the urgency, ears flicking toward the approaching riders. Ethan stepped back, giving her space, his eyes already moving past her to the ridge where shapes had begun to form against the horizon. Dark figures cutting through the pale dust. "Ride north," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach her. "Follow the creek for half a mile, then cut through the trees. The ground there hides tracks better than open land. Clara nodded once, a small movement, but one that held more weight than words, then gathered the reins, guiding the horse toward the narrow path along the water. She did not look back. Ethan watched her go, the sound of hooves against damp earth fading into the steady rush of the creek, until she disappeared between the trees, swallowed by shadow and distance. The moment stretched, quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This one carried consequence. Ethan turned slowly, facing the ridge, his posture straightening, his shoulders settling as if he had just taken on something he could not set down. The riders crested the hill seconds later, 5 of them, maybe 6, their figures clear now, moving fast, scanning the ground, following a trail that led straight to the water's edge. Ethan stepped forward into the open, boots sinking slightly into the mud where Clara had stood moments before, his hands hanging loose at his sides, empty, visible. He did not reach for anything, did not call out. He simply stood there, alone by the creek, as the men closed the distance, their questions already forming long before they ever spoke them. The riders did not slow until they were within 20 yards, their horses breathing hard, hooves pressing deep into the damp earth near the creek, and the man in front, broad-shouldered with a dust-covered hat pulled low, raised one hand just enough to bring the others to a stop without a word. His eyes fixed on Ethan first, not the ground, not the water, but the man standing alone where something had clearly just happened. Silence stretched for a moment, broken only by the creek and the faint jingle of harness leather. "You out here alone, Cole?" the lead rider asked, his voice calm in a way that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Ethan did not shift his stance, did not glance back toward the trees where Clara had vanished. He only met the man's gaze with the same steady calm. "Looks that way," he answered. One of the riders to the left leaned slightly in his saddle, scanning the bank, his eyes catching the disturbed mud, the faint impressions of another set of tracks leading toward the water before disappearing. "Tracks end here," he muttered, not asking, just stating. The lead rider's gaze flicked briefly to the ground, then back to Ethan. "We are looking for someone," he said, slow, deliberate, as if giving Ethan the chance to place himself on one side of the matter or the other. "Woman passed through town this morning, heading north, caused some trouble on her way out," he added, his tone still even, but edged with something that suggested the story had already been decided before they arrived. Ethan let a breath out. Through his nose, quiet, controlled, his eyes dropping for just a second to the water, watching it move. "Carry, erase. You see her?" the rider asked. The question hung there, simple on the surface, but heavy with everything it implied. Ethan lifted his gaze again, his expression unchanged. "No," he said. It was a clean word, short, with no hesitation, and it settled into the space between them like a stone. The men did not move right away. One of them shifted in his saddle, another glanced toward the ridge behind Ethan as if expecting something to emerge from the trees at any moment. The lead rider studied him a second longer, then tilted his head slightly. "Strange place to be standing alone," he said. Ethan gave a small shrug, the kind that did not invite further questions. "Lost a steer," he replied, nodding toward the open land as if that explained everything that needed explaining. The man's eyes followed the gesture for a brief second, then returned, weighing the answer, not accepting it, but not dismissing it either. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the creek, softening the edges of tracks that might have told a different story a minute ago. One of the riders shifted again, his gaze catching on Ethan's hands, still damp, still marked faintly by the water he had stepped through. "Water is cold today," the rider said, almost casually. Ethan glanced down at his hands as if noticing it for the first time, then wiped them slowly against his shirt. "Colder than yesterday," he answered. Another silence followed, longer this time, stretched thin by the sound of the creek and the weight of unspoken doubt. The lead rider finally exhaled, a quiet sound, then straightened, slightly in his saddle. "If you see her," he said, his voice firm now, "you let us know." Ethan nodded once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging the words as they were given. The man held his gaze for one last second, then turned his horse with a small pull of the reins. The others followed, spreading out along the bank, some riding upstream, others downstream, their eyes scanning, their presence pressing into the land like something that did not belong but would not leave. Ethan remained where he was, still, silent, until the sound of hooves began to fade again, until the creak was the loudest thing left, and only then did he allow his shoulders to ease, just slightly, as if he had been holding something steady long enough to let it pass without breaking. The last of the riders disappeared beyond the bend, their shapes dissolving into dust and distance, but the tension they left behind did not go with them. It stayed in the air, settled into the ground, lingered in the quiet like something waiting to be named. Ethan stood there a while longer, eyes fixed on the empty stretch of land where they had gone, listening not just for sound but for absence, for the moment when pursuit turned into doubt, and doubt into something else. The creek moved steady beside him, carrying small fragments of leaves and silt, smoothing over what had been disturbed, erasing edges the way time always did when given enough patience. He finally stepped back from the bank, boots pulling free from the soft mud with a slow, deliberate motion, and turned toward the path Clara had taken, though there was nothing left to see but shadow and trees. She had not looked back, and he knew she would not. Not because she lacked gratitude, but because people like her did not survive by holding on to what had already passed. Ethan reached down, brushing his hand along the damp grass where her tracks had once been clear, now fading, broken by wind and water, and for a moment, he let himself wonder how far she would make it before the world caught up again. Not long, he figured, unless something changed. The thought stayed with him as he walked back to where his horse had stood earlier, now gone, leaving only the faint imprint of hooves pressed into the dirt. He did not rush, did not call out. He simply moved with the same quiet certainty that had guided him at the creek, following the line of the land back toward the open range. The sun had shifted higher, casting longer light across the hills, and in that light, everything looked clearer than it had before, sharper, more defined, as if the world was reminding him that choices did not blur just because no one spoke of them. By the time he reached the rise overlooking the town, the distant shapes of buildings came into view, low and worn, resting under a sky that did not care what happened beneath it. A thin line of smoke curled from a chimney near the center, and a few riders moved along the main road, small figures against the wide stretch of land. Nothing looked different from where he stood, nothing showed what had nearly unfolded at the creek, and that was the way of it out here. Things changed without leaving marks. Anyone else could see. Ethan paused there, just for a second, his gaze sweeping over the town, not searching for anyone, but measuring something in his own mind. He knew what would come next, not from guesswork, but from experience, because stories did not end at the moment a choice was made. They carried forward, shaped by who told them and who stayed silent. He started down the slope, steps steady, unhurried, each one closing the distance between him and whatever waited in that quiet cluster of buildings. Somewhere behind him, beyond the trees, the creek kept running, unchanged, and somewhere ahead, men would be asking questions that no longer had simple answers. Ethan did not rehearse what he would say, did not plan how he would stand or where he would look. He only carried the same stillness with him, the same calm that had held at the water's edge, because out here, the truth was not always what happened. It was what a man chose to carry when no one else was there to see it. By the time Ethan stepped onto the main road, the town had already begun to shift in that quiet way it always did when something unseen had passed through it. Doors half open, voices lower than usual, eyes lingering just a second too long on anything out of place. He walked past the general store first, its wooden sign creaking softly in the wind, and a man standing near the entrance paused mid-sentence when he saw Ethan approach, his gaze dropping briefly to Ethan's boots, still marked faintly with dried creek mud. Nothing was said, but the silence carried more than words ever could. Further down, a pair of horses were tied outside the sheriff's office, their saddles still dusted from a hard ride, and Ethan recognized one of them from the ridge, the same dark coat, the same worn leather straps. He did not slow, did not turn his head. He simply kept walking, his steps even, his posture unchanged, as if the town was no different today than it had been yesterday. But it was. He could feel it in the way the air held still between buildings, in the way a woman pulling water from a barrel stopped just long enough to watch him pass, her expression unreadable, The sheriff's door opened behind him with a low creak, and a voice followed, firm but not loud. "Cole," it called. Ethan stopped, not immediately, but after 2 more steps, then turned slowly, his eyes meeting Sheriff Dalton Reeves across the short stretch of dirt. Reeves stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, his hat pushed back just enough to show a face that had seen too many versions of the same story. "You been out north?" the sheriff asked, not accusing, not friendly, just direct. Ethan nodded once. "Lost a steer," he said, the same answer as before, unchanged, steady. Reeves studied him for a moment, his gaze sharp in a way that missed little, then glanced briefly toward Ethan's hands before returning to his face. "Riders came through here not long ago," he said, stepping out onto the porch, boots thudding softly against the wood. "Said they were looking for a woman," he added, his tone still even, but carrying the weight of something that mattered. Ethan did not respond right away, his eyes drifting past the sheriff to the street beyond, where dust moved slowly across the ground. "Plenty of folks pass through," he said after a moment. Reeves let out a quiet breath, not quite a sigh, more like the sound a man makes when he already knows the answer he is not going to get. "This one left a trail," he said, his gaze steady now, holding Ethan in place without force. The space between them settled into something heavier, not confrontation, not yet, but close enough to feel. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not retreating, not advancing, just standing where he was, as if the ground itself had decided for him. "Trail ends at the creek," Reeves continued, watching him carefully. Ethan met his eyes again, calm, unflinching. "Creek washes a lot of things away," he said. The words hung there, simple, but carrying more than they seemed. Reeves looked at him a second longer, then nodded once, slow, thoughtful, as if filing something away for later. "If you remember anything worth saying," the sheriff added, stepping back toward the doorway, "you come find me." Ethan gave a small nod in return, not promising, not refusing, just acknowledging the space between what was known and what would remain that way. As Reeves turned and disappeared inside, the door closing behind him with a soft thud, the town seemed to breathe again, quiet but watchful, and Ethan stood there a moment longer before moving on, carrying with him the same stillness he had brought down from the creek, knowing that whatever came next would not ask for the truth, only for a version of it someone could live with. The afternoon settled over the town like a weight that nobody named but everyone felt, and Ethan could sense it in the way conversations paused when he passed, in the way doors closed a little slower than usual, not to shut him out, but to hold something in. He stepped into the stable near the edge of the main road, the scent of hay and worn leather thick in the air, familiar, grounding, and for a moment, it felt like stepping back into a world that still followed simple rules. His horse stood in the far stall, calm, chewing slowly, unaware of the shift that had taken place beyond the hills, and Ethan ran a hand along its neck, the steady warmth of it anchoring him. Outside, voices drifted in and out, low, uncertain, like a town trying to agree on a story before it had all the pieces. "They say she headed north," someone murmured beyond the open door. "They say a lot of things," another voice replied. Ethan did not turn, did not listen too closely, but the words settled anyway, fragments building something he had already chosen not to complete. He reached for a brush, moving it along the horse's coat in slow, even strokes, each pass deliberate, controlled, the rhythm steady against the rising tension outside. The stable door creaked again, and a figure stepped in, boots tapping softly against the wooden floor. It was Thomas Grady, the blacksmith, a man who rarely came in here unless something had already gone wrong somewhere else. He stopped a few feet behind Ethan, arms crossed, watching without speaking at first. "You hear what happened out past the creek?" Thomas asked finally, his voice low, carrying that same careful tone the rest of the town had adopted. Ethan did not stop brushing, did not turn, just let the motion continue. "Heard enough," he said. Thomas shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the open door before looking back. "Men came through asking about a woman," he added, as if Ethan might not already know. "Said she caused trouble, said she ran," he continued, each word placed like a stone in water, testing how far the ripples would go. Ethan let the brush fall still for a moment, then set it aside, resting his hand on the wooden rail. People run for all kinds of reasons, he said quietly. Thomas studied him, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought. That they do, he replied, then took a step closer, lowering his voice even more. But not all of them leave riders behind looking like that, he added. The silence that followed was not empty. It held something sharper now, something closer to understanding than before. Ethan turned then, finally facing him, his expression unchanged, steady as ever. "And what do you think they are looking for?" he asked. Thomas hesitated, just for a second, then shook his head slightly. "Not what," he said. "Who?" And there was a difference in that word, a weight that came from knowing a story had already chosen its villain. Ethan held his gaze, unflinching, then gave a small nod, as if accepting something that did not need to be argued. "Then I suppose they will keep looking," he said. Thomas watched him a moment longer, searching for something that did not show, then let out a slow breath and stepped back. "You always did know how to stay out of things," he said, though there was no accusation in it, only observation. Ethan did not respond, because both of them knew that was not entirely true anymore. Thomas turned and walked back toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance over his shoulder. "Careful where you stand, Ethan," he added quietly. "Sometimes that is all it takes to end up on the wrong side of a story." The door swung shut behind him, leaving Ethan alone again with the quiet, the steady breathing of the horse, and the weight of a choice that no one else had seen, but that was already beginning to shape everything that came after. The sun had begun its slow descent when Ethan finally stepped out of the stable, the light stretching long across the street, turning dust into something almost golden, and for a moment, the town looked peaceful again, like nothing had shifted beneath its surface. But the quiet was thinner, now, stretched tight by questions that had not found answers, and Ethan could feel it in the way the air seemed to hold its breath. He moved toward the edge of town, without hurry, boots steady against the packed dirt, his eyes drifting toward the northern trail where the land opened into rolling hills and scattered trees. Somewhere out there, Clara was either still ahead of the riders or already being pulled back into the story they had decided for her. And the difference between those two outcomes rested on something as fragile as time. He stopped near the old water trough at the edge of the road, resting one hand against the worn wood, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the light began to fade. A faint movement caught his attention then, not close, not immediate, but enough to pull his focus tighter. Dust rose in a thin line far out past the ridge, not scattered like before, but gathered, controlled, moving with purpose. Riders again, but not searching this time, not spreading out. These were coming back together. Ethan straightened slightly, his shoulders settling as he watched the line shift direction, angling toward the town instead of away from it. They had not found her, not yet, and that meant something had changed. Behind him, a door opened somewhere along the street, voices lifting, sharper now, carrying farther in the cooling air. Word was moving, faster than horses, faster than truth. Ethan turned back toward the town, his steps measured, his expression unchanged, but inside, something had already begun to adjust, like a man preparing for weather he could not see but knew was coming. He passed the sheriff's office again, the door still closed, but a shadow moved behind the window, pacing slow, deliberate. Reeves was not done asking questions, not by a long shot. Further down, two men stood near the general store, their conversation cutting off as Ethan approached, their eyes following him in that quiet way people had when they were deciding how much they believed. He did not meet their gaze, did not slow, just kept walking until the sound of hooves reached him again, louder this time, closer, no longer distant enough to ignore. The riders came into view at the far end of the street, 6 of them now, dust-covered, their horses moving with the tired certainty of men who had not found what they were sent for. The lead rider's eyes scanned the town as they entered, not hurried, not frantic, but focused in a way that suggested their search had shifted from the land to the people. Ethan stopped near the center of the road, not blocking their path, not stepping aside, just standing where he was, visible, still. The lead rider recognized him. Immediately, his gaze locking in, and something unreadable passed across his face, not suspicion alone, but something closer to confirmation. The horses slowed as they approached, the rhythm of their movement echoing off the buildings, drawing attention from every doorway, every window. The town watched now, openly, no longer pretending not to see. Ethan did not move, did not speak. He simply waited, the same way he had at the creek. The same stillness settling over him like something chosen, not forced. Because out here, it was not the man who ran that drew the line. It was the one who stayed when he had every reason to leave. The riders slowed to a stop no more than 10 feet from Ethan, their horses shifting beneath them, restless but controlled, and the lead man studied him in silence for a long moment, as if measuring not just the man in front of him, but the space around him, the town behind him, the story that was beginning to settle whether anyone spoke it or not. Dust hung in the air between them, catching the last light of day, turning everything softer at the edges but sharper at the center. "You said you saw nothing," the rider finally said, his voice calm, almost quiet, but it carried across the street like it had been waiting to be spoken. Ethan did not look away, did not shift his stance, his hands still loose at his sides, empty, open. "I said I did not see her," he answered. The difference was small, but it did not go unnoticed. One of the other men shifted in his saddle, glancing toward the sheriff's office, then back again, as if deciding whether to let this remain a conversation or turn it into something else. The lead rider tilted his head slightly, a faint narrowing of the eyes, not anger, not yet, but something closer to curiosity sharpened by doubt. "And the creek?" he asked. Ethan let a breath out slow, steady, his gaze dropping for just a second before returning. "It is still there," he said. A few people along the street shifted at that, the kind of movement that came when a line was drawn and everyone felt it, but no one named it. The rider studied him again, longer this time, then glanced down at the ground near Ethan's boots, where faint traces of dried mud still clung, where the story he was trying to read did not quite match the one being told. "Funny thing about water," the rider said, almost to himself. "It washes things away, but it does not choose what stays behind." Ethan did not respond, because there was nothing to add to that, nothing that would not tip the balance one way or the other. The silence stretched, tighter now, pulled between what could be proven and what could only be believed. Then the sheriff's door opened behind them, the sound cutting clean through the moment. Dalton Reeves stepped out onto the porch, his eyes moving from the riders to Ethan and back again, taking in the distance, the posture, the weight of what had settled in the middle of the street. "You found what you were looking for?" Reeves asked, his voice steady, but carrying authority in a way that shifted the balance slightly. The lead rider did not look away from Ethan when he answered. "Not yet," he said. Reeves nodded once, slow, thoughtful, then stepped down from the porch, boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. "Then I suggest you keep your questions clear," he said. Not a warning, not a command, but something that held both. The rider's gaze finally broke from Ethan, turning toward the sheriff, and in that moment, the tension eased just enough to breathe again. "We will," he replied. Another pause followed, shorter this time, less sharp, as if the edge had been dulled but not removed. Then, with a small pull of the reins, the lead rider guided his horse forward, passing Ethan by inches, close enough to feel the weight of his presence without a word spoken. The others followed, one by one, moving through the town. Again, slower now, more deliberate, their search no longer just for tracks, but for something that could not be seen on the ground. Ethan remained where he was, unmoving, his eyes following them only for a moment before settling back ahead, toward nothing in particular. The town exhaled slowly around him, conversations beginning again in low voices, doors opening just enough to let sound carry. And in that quiet return to normal, something had already shifted beyond repair, because the truth had passed through this place, not as something spoken, but as something chosen, and that choice was now standing in the middle of the street, saying nothing at all. The street did not return to what it had been, not really. It only pretended to, the way towns did when something unsettled passed through and left no clear mark behind. And Ethan could feel that pretense settle around him like dust that refused to fall. Sheriff Reeves remained where he was for a moment after the riders moved on, his eyes still on Ethan, not pressing, not asking, just watching with the patience of a man who knew that truth did not always come when called. "Walk with me," Reeves said finally, turning without waiting for an answer, stepping off toward the side of the building where the noise of the street softened. Ethan followed after a brief pause, his boots steady against the ground, his expression unchanged. They stopped near the edge of the alley, where the light did not reach as cleanly and the sounds of the town faded into something distant. Reeves leaned one shoulder against the wooden wall, arms folding loosely across his chest, his gaze settling on Ethan with quiet weight. "You have been around long enough to know how this goes," he said, not as a question. Ethan gave a slight nod. "Most things out here do not need saying," he replied. Reeves let out a slow breath through his nose, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "That is true," he said. "But sometimes what is not said carries more trouble than what is." The words lingered, not sharp, but firm, like something placed carefully between them. Ethan did not answer right away, his gaze drifting briefly toward the open street beyond the alley, where figures moved in slow, cautious rhythms. "Trouble finds its own path," he said after a moment. Reeves studied him, searching for something deeper than the words, something that might explain why a man would stand in the middle of that street and hold his ground without giving anything away. "And what path are you on?" the sheriff asked quietly. The question settled heavier than the others, not because it demanded an answer, but because it did not need one. Ethan met his eyes, steady as ever, the same calm that had held at the creek, at the ridge, in the street. "The one I am already on," he said. Reeves held his gaze a second longer, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a truth he did not fully like, but understood all the same. "If those men come back with less patience," he said, pushing off the wall, "this town will not stand in their way without something solid to hold on to." Ethan understood what he meant, not protection, not loyalty, but a reason, something that could be pointed to and agreed upon. Silence followed, stretching between them, not empty, but full of everything neither of them would say. Then Reeves stepped past him, heading back toward the street, pausing only long enough to add, "Be sure you know what you are holding on to, Ethan." The sheriff's footsteps faded as he returned to the front, leaving Ethan alone in the narrow strip of shadow. For a moment, he did not move, did not shift, just stood there with the weight of the words settling into place. Then he turned his head slightly, looking back toward the northern trail beyond the buildings, beyond the dust, where the land opened and choices carried farther than voices ever could. Somewhere out there, Clara was still riding, still ahead of the version of her that the town was beginning to build, and Ethan knew that the distance between those two things would not hold forever. He stepped out of the alley then, back into the fading light, not to change what had already been set in motion, but to stand where it would matter when it returned, because some choices did not end when they were made. They waited, quiet and patient, for the moment they would be tested again. The light had nearly slipped behind the hills when the sound returned again, not scattered this time, not searching, but direct, deliberate, and heavier than before, like men who had decided that whatever they were looking for would be found one way or another. Ethan stood near the center of town, not waiting, not preparing, just present. As the riders came back into view from the northern trail, their formation tighter now, their pace slower, more controlled, like something had changed between the moment they left and the moment they returned. Dust followed them in a low cloud, but it did not rise as high as before, as if even the land had begun to settle around what was coming. The lead rider's eyes locked onto Ethan again before the horses had fully stopped, not with surprise, but with recognition sharpened into something firmer, something closer to certainty. "We rode north," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet street without effort. "And we found where the tracks turned." Ethan did not respond, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, giving nothing that could be taken and turned into something else. The man continued, leaning slightly forward in his saddle, not aggressive, but intent. "Whoever she is, she knew the land, knew how to lose us, and that means she had help, or she had time." The words settled into the space between them, not loud, but heavy, like a door closing somewhere out of sight. People along the street had stopped pretending not to watch now, standing in doorways, near windows, their silence thicker than before, waiting for something to break. Ethan let a slow breath out, his eyes drifting for just a second toward the fading line of hills, then back again. "Sounds like she made her choice," he said. The rider's expression did not change, but something in his gaze tightened, like a man hearing only part of what he needed. "People do not just vanish," he replied. "Not without leaving something behind." Ethan nodded slightly, as if agreeing with a truth that did not belong to either of them alone. "Sometimes they do," he said quietly. "If they know what matters enough to leave the rest." A murmur moved through the small crowd, not words. Just the sound of something shifting, uncertain which way it would fall. The sheriff stepped forward again from the edge of the street, his presence steady, not interfering, but not absent either. "You have ridden hard," Reeves said to the lead man, his tone even, measured, "and you have not found what you were sent for." The rider glanced at him briefly, then back to Ethan, as if the answer he needed was still standing right where it had been all along. "Not yet," he said again, but this time the words carried less patience, more weight. The moment stretched, pulled tight between what could be demanded and what could not be forced. Ethan did not move, did not shift. He simply stood there with the same stillness that had followed him from the creek, from the ridge, from every step that had led to this point, because he understood something the others did not, that the truth they were looking for was not something he could give without changing what had already been set in motion, and some things, once set, could not be called back without breaking more than they fixed. The rider studied him one last time, long and quiet, as if trying to decide whether the man in front of him was hiding something or simply standing where he had chosen to stand. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his saddle, the tension in his posture easing just enough to let the moment pass without snapping. "We will keep looking," he said. But there was something different in it now, something that suggested the search had already begun to shift from the land to the people who refused to speak. Ethan gave a small nod, not agreement, not defiance, just acknowledgement. And as the riders turned once more, the town remained still, caught between what had happened and what would come next. Because sometimes the loudest part of a story was not the truth itself, but the silence that kept it standing. The riders did not leave the town this time. Not completely. They spread out along the edges instead, some near the northern trail, others closer to the main road, their presence settling in like a storm that had not yet decided where to break. And Ethan could feel the shift immediately, the way movement slowed, the way voices dropped even further, the way every glance carried a question that no one wanted to ask out loud. He remained where he was for a moment longer, watching them take their positions, not with urgency, not with fear, but with the quiet understanding that whatever came next would not pass through as easily as before. Sheriff Reeves stepped closer again, stopping just to Ethan's side this time, not facing him directly, but close enough that their words would not carry beyond. "Them, they are not leaving," Reeves said under his breath. Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes still on the riders. "No," he replied. "They are waiting." Reeves let out a slow breath, his gaze shifting across the street, measuring distance, people, exits, all the things a man in his position had learned to count without thinking. "Waiting changes things," he said. Ethan did not answer right away, because they both knew it did. Waiting gave time for doubt to grow, for stories to take shape, for lines to be drawn where none had existed before. A rider near the edge of town dismounted then, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, and he began walking slowly toward the center, not rushing, not signaling, just moving with purpose. Others followed with their eyes, not their bodies, creating a quiet circle of attention that closed in without anyone stepping forward. The man stopped about 15 feet from Ethan and Reeves, his gaze moving between them, not aggressive, but certain. "We will stay the night," he said, not asking for permission, not offering explanation, just placing the decision into the air like something that had already been agreed upon. Reeves straightened slightly, his voice steady when he answered. "You can stay, as long as it stays peaceful." The man gave a small nod, as if that condition meant very little either way, then turned his attention back to Ethan. "People talk more when the sun goes down," he said. Ethan met his gaze, calm, unreadable. "Sometimes," he replied. The man studied him for a second longer, then stepped back, returning to his place without another word, leaving the space between them heavier than before. The sky had begun to darken now. The last light slipping behind the hills, and lanterns flickered to life along the street, small points of glow against the growing shadow. The town did not disperse, did not return to its routines. It lingered, watching, waiting, as if something unseen had taken hold and no one was willing to be the first to move against it. Ethan finally shifted his stance, not retreating, not advancing, just adjusting. The same way a man might when he knew he would be standing for a long time. His eyes drifted once more toward the north, toward the land beyond the reach of lantern light, where darkness came faster and stayed longer. Somewhere out there, Clara was still ahead of the story being built in her name, still moving through a world that had not yet caught up to her. And the space between that freedom and what waited here felt thinner now, stretched by every passing minute. Ethan understood then that this was no longer about what had happened at the creek, not in the way the others saw it. It had become something else, something quieter but heavier, a test not of truth, but of who would hold it and who would let it go. And as the night settled over the town, bringing with it the kind of silence that carried more than sound ever could, Ethan remained exactly where he had chosen to stand, because some lines were not drawn in the dirt or the water, they were drawn in the space a man refused to step away from. Even when the world began to close in around him, the night settled fully over the town, wrapping every building, every street, every waiting figure in a quiet that felt heavier than any storm. And still, no one moved first. Lantern light flickered against wooden walls, casting long shadows that stretched and shifted with every small motion, and Ethan stood among them, unmoving, as if he had become part of that stillness itself. The riders remained where they had placed themselves, patient now, watchful, no longer chasing, because they understood something had already happened here, something they had missed, and that meant the answer was not out there in the dark. It was here, somewhere between silence and choice. Sheriff Reeves lingered near the edge of the street, his posture steady, his eyes moving from one face to another, not forcing anything, but not letting it slip away either. Time passed in slow increments, marked only by the soft creak of wood, the distant call of night birds, and the steady breath of horses shifting under saddles. Then, without warning, a small sound broke the stillness, not loud, not sharp, just enough to turn heads. A boy stepped out from the side of the general store, no older than 12, his hat clutched in both hands, his eyes wide with the kind of courage that only came when fear had nowhere else to go. He looked at the riders first, then at the sheriff, and finally at Ethan, as if searching for something he did not yet understand. "I saw her," the boy said, his voice thin but clear enough to carry. The words moved through the town like a ripple, drawing every gaze tighter, pulling every breath shorter. Reeves stepped forward slightly, his voice calm. "Careful, what did you see?" The boy swallowed, glancing once more at Ethan before answering. "She was riding north," he said. "Fast, like she was trying to stay ahead of something." He hesitated, then added, "But she stopped. Just for a second, near the trees past the bend." The riders leaned forward slightly, attention sharpening, and the lead man spoke. "What happened then?" The boy's grip tightened on his hat, his eyes lowering for a moment before lifting again. "She looked back," he said quietly. "Not at the road, at the town." Silence followed, deeper than before, because that detail did not fit the story they had been building. It did not match a person running without thought. It suggested something else, something chosen. The boy shifted his weight, then added one last piece, almost as if he did not realize how much it mattered, and she smiled. Just a little, like she knew something we did not. No one spoke after that. Not the riders, not the sheriff, not the townsfolk. The moment hung there, fragile, balanced, on what could be taken from it. Ethan did not move, but something in his gaze softened, just barely, like a man hearing the echo of a choice carried farther than he expected. The lead rider leaned back slowly in his saddle, the tension in his posture easing not from satisfaction, but from something quieter, something closer to understanding that this was no longer a trail he could follow. "We ride at first light," he said at last, his voice no longer searching, just stating. No one argued, no one questioned. The riders turned away one by one, settling into the night without another word, their presence no longer pressing, just existing. Sheriff Reeves watched them go, then glanced at Ethan, Not asking, not judging, just acknowledging what had passed without needing it spoken. The town began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, as if something tight had loosened just enough to allow it. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer before finally turning his gaze north, toward the darkness beyond the hills, where no lantern light reached, where no voices carried. Somewhere out there, Clara Whitlock was no longer running from anything. She was moving toward something else entirely, something that could not be named here, not in this town, not in this story. And Ethan understood then that the truth had not been lost at the creek. It had been carried forward, quiet and unseen, held not in words, but in the space between what a man could say and what he chose to protect. He turned back toward the dim glow of the town, his steps slow, steady, leaving no mark that anyone would follow, because out here, justice did not always arrive with noise or witness. Sometimes it came like the night itself, silent, certain, and strong enough to hold without ever needing to be seen.